Welcome back to installing a clustered SQL Server instance. So we left off in our demonstration looking at the disk space requirement screen. So you can see here that so far we're only using the C drive. We haven't told SQL Server where our data files are going to go yet. All it knows is where the actual binaries are going to be installed to. So that's the only disk space check that it's doing so far. So go ahead and click Next, and we're going to be taken to another new screen. So this next screen is showing us the resource groups that are on the server and giving us the opportunity to select an existing resource group or to create a new one. Now, a resource group is a logical construct that groups all the various resources for that service together. So resources are defined as basically anything that's going to be managed by failover clustering. The SQL Server service, the SQL agent, any shared disks that are available to all the nodes of the cluster. These are all going to be resources that are all going to be put in a single group. The reason we need to put the resources into a group is so that we can ensure that the resources all fail over from one server to another together as a group. We don't want to try running the SQL Server on one node and the SQL Server agent on another node, for example. So in this case, we're going to go ahead and name our resource group. Now, personally, I always like to name the resource group the same name as the network name for SQL Server. The reason I like to do this is it simply makes it a lot easier to figure out what's what. I don't like using the default resource group names because they don't make a whole lot of sense when you start trying to line things up and figuring out what's what. Normally when we're looking at this stuff is when there's some sort of problem. So because of that, we want to make sure that we've got everything exactly lined up and easy to figure out what's what. We don't want to have to think about what resource group goes with which instance. So we just go ahead and type in the name of the resource group we want to use, and then go ahead and click Next. Now, the other nice thing about using the same resource group name as the network name is you know that they're going to be unique already. So this next screen is showing us the cluster disk selection. Now, this is blank in my environment because I don't have any shared disks between my virtual machines because I don't have any sort of SAN storage configured. If I did have SAN storage configured and had a shared disk in this environment, those disks would be listed here. They'd be shown at the top and the bottom. So I'd be able to simply select the disks I want on the bottom and then click Next. Because I'm going to do everything at the network level through a network share, I don't need to worry about selecting disks on this particular screen or the fact that there's no disks listed. I'm just going to go ahead and click Next and go on to the next screen. So this next screen is the cluster network configuration screen. On this particular screen, it's simply showing me what networks are available on my Windows cluster. So in this case, I only have one subnet available, and I'm using DHCP to work with that subnet. So I'm going to go ahead and select the checkbox for that subnet and leave the checkbox for DHCP checked because I am using DHCP on this network. If I were using static IPs, I would uncheck that checkbox and go ahead and just type in the appropriate IP address that I want to use for my SQL Server cluster. But because I'm using DHCP, we're going to go ahead and just check that checkbox and get an IP address from the DHCP server automatically. We're going to go ahead and click Next once we've made these changes. On the next screen, this should look very familiar if you've installed SQL Server 2012 before. This is simply a list of all the services and the accounts that everything's going to run under. Now, in this particular environment, we need to select a domain account because whenever you're installing SQL Server as a clustered instance, you have to use a domain account. So let's go ahead and take a look at all the domain accounts that are available to us, and we'll go ahead and find one that we're going to use. So there's a SQL Server domain account listed there, so we're going to go ahead and grab that account, click OK, and then we're going to go ahead and specify the password for that account. We're going to go ahead and do the same thing for the SQL Server agent. You'll see that the startup type for both the SQL Server Database engine and the agent is set to manual, and these are grayed out. You can't click on these fields. That's because we want to leave those as manual. SQL Server doesn't start up automatically in a clustered environment like you normally think it does. While it will start automatically the first time it's started and whenever all the machines are rebooted, cluster service is what's going to start the SQL Server service. The SQL Server service does not start automatically like it normally would. We can go ahead and select our collation if we need a different collation than the default. The screen is going to look exactly like it normally would. It appears we have a password error for our domain password. There we go. There's the correct password this time. Then we go ahead and click Next. The next screen is extremely familiar looking to everybody, hopefully. Hopefully everybody's installed SQL Server 2012 before. This screen is simply the authentication mode screen and who's going to be a local administrator. So in this case, I'm going to make myself an administrator, and we're using Windows Authentication Mode only. Now for the data directory, this is where things are going to be a little bit different from what you would normally see. So we're going to use a network share on DC1 share SQL 1. That's going to be the network share that we're going to create all our data files on. Now, if this was a production cluster, I would probably not do this. I would probably instead put everything on shared disk that's going to be on some sort of high-end SAN. Because of the lab environment I'm working with, I don't have that as an option, unfortunately. Now, normally, again, I would also put my TempDB in a different location, or a different drive, same with my backups. Now, one of the nice things about SQL Server 2012 is that I can actually put my TempDB on local disk. So, for example, if I've got high TempDB requirements for my application, I can put my application on a shared drive or on a SAN drive, and I can put my TempDB on local disk. Now, I do need to make sure that my TempDB folder that I'm using does exist. We're going to go ahead and create that real fast just to be on the safe side. We're going to do the TempDB directory and log directory in the same location, and we're going to put the backup directory out on a network share. Now, the reason you might want to do this is because maybe you want to use high-end Fusion I/O cards or some other sort of flash drive or solid-state drive as your TempDB repository, or where your TempDB is going to go. So because of that, we would want to use the local flash drive instead of SAN flash drives, because the SAN flash drives are incredibly expensive, much, much more expensive than local flash drives. Click on the File Stream tab. Now you'll note we have a warning over on this side. We specified file server data as the data directory. To avoid possible failures, make sure the SQL Service account has full control over this folder. In my environment, I know that it already does because the SQL Server service in this case has administrative rights on that domain controller. So we can click Next. I get the same warning message popping up again. I get the standard error reporting message. We're just going to go ahead and click Next. We do a cluster installation rule check. Very similar stuff that we normally see. FAT32 file system, we've passed that. We're using NTSF. We get a cluster resource DLL update restart check. This is just making sure that we don't need to restart anything funky and that the cluster isn't pending an update to these DLLs post-install. I'm going to go ahead and click Next. We're going to get a summary of what we've got installed, and we get a configuration path located here, which we can use for unintended installs later on. Now, this configuration file cannot be used to install your passive nodes or your other nodes of the cluster. The reason for that is this configuration file is set up to do a full initial node installation, not a secondary node installation, which we're going to be walking through in a little bit when we get through a few more slides. So we're going to go ahead and click Install, and then that's going to go ahead and run through the actual installation process. So we're going to go ahead and complete this installation during our next video, and then we're going to go ahead and complete the slides as well.